Thank you so much for joining us. In particular to our friends from our sister centres in Johannesburg and Cape Town. And I know that Richard Friedman had registered, and I'm sure he will be joining us. Richard was the director at the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Centre until last year. It's wonderful to have Richard join us. I would particularly like to welcome the trustees, three of the trustees from our centre, Sydney Lazarus, Linda Nathan and Thomas Hashfield. I do value your support and wisdom, not only for being here tonight, but always. The centre, our Durban Holocaust and Genocide Centre, is a centre of memory and education. And as you know, for the past 6 months, we've been closed to visitors. We are, however, a tiny bit optimistic about being able to reopen by appointment. And we're putting protocols in place and hoping that in the middle of October, following the success of hopefully the opening that's already begun in the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre, we'll be starting to take bookings. I would like to now formally welcome Murry Sidlin, tell you a little bit about his incredible academic and musical prowess. And then the format of the evening will be that Murry and I will be in conversation about the film, but I think more about the backstory. We all saw the film, but I had so many questions after watching it. And I just wanted to start by saying that I stumbled upon the Defiant Requiem Foundation. A colleague introduced me to a webinar that they were hosting, which I joined. And I didn't understand, what is a Defiant Requiem Foundation? So I got onto the internet, as we all do when we're curious, and found the most extraordinary website about an organization doing wonderful work, pivoting around this original film that was created, or story around Verdi's Requiem at Terezin. So that night, before going to sleep, I wrote a long story to every email that I could find on their website and said, I live in South Africa. I would love to share a little bit about this story. Can you tell me more? I'd like to share it with my colleagues and friends. And by the time I woke up the following morning, Louisa, Mark, and Alexandra had all written the most warm and enthusiastic replies. So, Murry, what a credit to you that the organization was just so responsive and said, we'd love to expand our reach into South Africa. And so here we are. We began the discussion around how we would find out more about the film. And they said, well, we're sure that Murry would spend an evening and talk to your audience and tell them how he began the journey. And so let's begin with that discussion. I'm going to, as I say, formally introduce Murry, who has a master's degree from the Peabody Institute. He is the founder and president of the Defiant Requiem Foundation. I love how he's described as a professor and conductor, an innovator, educator. What a remarkable human being who has, throughout his musical career, had a number of posts as conductor at symphony orchestras. For 32 years, he was the co-director of the American Academy of Conducting at the Aspen Festival. And he's currently the professor of conducting at the Catholic University of America's School of Music, where for 10 years until 2012, he served as dean of the school. This is a beautiful and moving documentary, Defiant Requiem, which is a story very close to Murry's heart. And I would like to ask you if we could begin the conversation. I just wanted to make one reference that when I watched it again for the third time this weekend, I was poignantly aware that there was this mad scramble at Terezin in 1943 to have the first performance, because the expectation of a transport on the 6th of September was looming. And here we are, and the weekend that we all watched it over the 6th of September. And I suddenly thought, wow, there we are 77 years later, watching the film about what was happening at that time. So what I'd like to ask you, Murry, if you could briefly describe what is Defiant Requiem and how did it come about?
Well, Defiant Requiem, Murry, first of all, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you for your warm introduction. I'm so pleased to meet everyone, and thank you for taking your time this Sunday evening to join with me and I with you. Defiant Requiem really refers to the way in which the Verde Requiem, the great spiritual, cultural work of art, the Verde Requiem, perhaps the second most performed oratorio in the history of music, that this work really became a sign and symbol and a kind of nutritious opportunity to remain aloof from the dangers of being in this concentration camp. It was a terrible place. Terezin is often thought of as a kind of Club Med of concentration camps. After all, there was a major arts and humanities community. Yes, but it was a concentration camp in terms of the gruel they were fed and the lack of medical attention and the lack of protection from the elements. And so there were some 34,000 murders in Terezin. And of course, most of that was malnutrition and disease. So how did I stumble onto this story? I want you to know that I did not originate the story in terms of its becoming well known. I stumbled across it and then maybe helped it along a little bit. At the time that I became aware of this, I was teaching at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. And I had just accepted a position to go to Oregon, the Portland Orchestra in Oregon. And I was taking a walk on a beautiful spring sunny afternoon. And I came across a bookstore called the Bryn Mawr Books. And out in front of the bookstore, there was this huge table which had a kind of pyramid of books. You know the sort of place I mean, where you realize for $3, you are absolutely certain you're going to find a first edition Shakespeare if you look hard and long enough. And so I noticed this wonderful pyramid of books. And there was one book that was sort of sticking out. I like to say now in retrospect, it was beckoning to me, but at the time it was just sticking out of the pile. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I'll just put my fingers up at it and start to remove it and see what it is. I took a look. I remember taking a look at my watch to see that if I knocked the pile over, do I have the 10 minutes extra in my allotted time to pick up everything off the sidewalk? Turns out I did, but I didn't need it. I took the book and I just went like this, took a quick chance, and the book came out, and it was a book entitled Music at Terezin, or Terezin, depending on how some people pronounce it differently. So I thought to myself, Terezin, what do I know about Terezin? I realized I knew very little. I knew that it was located in the former Czechoslovakia. It was a concentration camp, a prison that was about 40 miles from Prague. I remember looking at a map once and saw that it was sort of northwest of Prague. And I opened the book to a table of contents, was just a series of names. So I thought, all right, I see this book is about those people who contributed something musical to the environment of Terezin. And I opened the book from the middle of the book and stumbled on a chapter, a very short chapter, 3 pages perhaps, entitled Rafael Schechter. And I had never heard of Raphael Schechter. In fact, I'd never heard of most of the names in the table of contents. But I knew that this was about the contributions they made, and should they have survived, something about what they did after the war as a practicing musician. This very short chapter about Schechter just said biographical material. He came from Romania. He did very well in his early musical years, a very musical family. He received some sort of grant to study in Brno, the second city in Czechoslovakia. And he went to study accompanying, conducting, and composition, what everybody studies. Following his couple of years at Brno, he went back to Prague, got a job as a kind of repetiteur at one of the opera companies. And the work that he started to do in Prague was gaining attention from the various opera companies. It was likely that he was going to have a career as an opera conductor, but war broke out, and it wasn't long before he and the majority of Jews living in Prague were then shipped off to this place called Terezín, a place that most of them had never heard of. It's a small town, and most people had never heard of it. So he gets to Terezín, and a couple of years later, he decides that the community, the arts community, which is now had produced almost 1,000 concerts, plus 2,400 lectures of every conceivable subject, 2,400 lectures by about 530 lecturers, people who were professionals. They were teachers, they were authors, they were psychologists, they were, of course, involved in religious work as religious studies or something more formal in religion. And so this community that sprang up, absolutely sprang up, no indication of any meetings that they held to say, okay, now we're going to have these concerts and this, that there was an opportunity to organize a concert series, included in which was something that they referred to as the New Music Studio. Now, this is really important, that there were some 20 composers at Terezín, and they managed to get their music performed. And they attracted audiences as well, which was quite unusual. It was also a sign and symbol of the future. New music means the future. And so how did all this happen? Did the Nazis permit this? Not at first. There were 3 commandants at Terezín, and the first 2 did not want anything other than work, get some sleep, go back to work, die, ship them out, whatever it was. It was rather stark and forlorn, and it was also extraordinarily painful. It was an era and a time and a place that was just full of punishment. It was a place of insanity and chaos, like most of the camps, and this was no exception. So the group of people that is most of the prisoners there, either as performers or lecturers or in some way contributing to the well-being of others, or even attending these lectures or performances, this was their way of finding a way to, first of all, stay alive, and also to find nutrition in the environment that they themselves created. So I stumbled on this book, and I saw that this was a rather extraordinary place. And the last few lines on the chapter of Rafael Schechter, it said, and he recruited a chorus of 150 volunteers, and by rote, he taught them Verdi's Requiem, and they gave 16 performances of the Verdi Requiem. It was 3 different choruses, by the way. That's a different story altogether. Some people, once they were moved out, and he recruited new people to start over again after some performances. And so this was a rather remarkable and frankly hard to believe story. I mean, having been a conductor now, having conducted the Verdi Requiem, knowing what it takes to put the Verdi Requiem together under optimum conditions, this was far from optimum. When people worked 12 hours a day, and they worked 8 days before they had half a day off, and so forth. So this was really hard work, labor, slave labor, and yet many of them who were recruited by Schechter had the inspiration to go into these basements at night and to be taught the Verde Requiem by rote. There was only one score in the camp, and Schechter had that score, and he gave it willingly over to the pianist, Gideon Klein, who was a magnificent composer, conductor. And so Schechter conducted from memory, and he taught. He had the women come down the basement one night, and he would plow through X number of bars and teach them that music. And then the next night the men, and then he would put it together and little by little proceed until they were able to master the singing of the Verde Requiem, and ultimately gave 16 performances. 15 were public, and one was for the International Red Cross. And so when I learned this story and saw it, my first instinct was, I have to prove that this happened or not happened. I was very concerned about any information going out about the Holocaust that could be refuted. That this was I know there are people who worry about this all the time. Deborah Lipstadt and her brilliant scholarship is one who concerns all the time about, is this true? Did it happen? Because the folks who are the Holocaust deniers and the revisionists are waiting in the wings. And if there's a major mistake, such as we say they sang 16 performances of the Verde Requiem, but in actuality it didn't happen, that feeds the efforts of the deniers and the revisionists. So this is such an incredibly complex tale to live in this environment and be a part of putting together a major oratorio such as this. I mean, a work of phenomenal difficulty. And yet, if it did happen, it's a major story. If it didn't happen, we have to stop it. We have to absolutely get on board to make sure that this is refuted. So by this time, I had bought the book for $3, and I read it cover to cover several times. I now moved to Oregon, and as soon as I get to Oregon, I get a call from a small college. I was there to be on the conducting staff of the Oregon Symphony, but I get this call from a small college outside of Portland, about 15 miles, a place called Pacific University. Out there, everything is Pacific. Everything is Pacific. You have the Pacific shoe shine shop downtown. Everything is Pacific. So this was Pacific University. And they asked me if I would come out and talk to them. They wanted to offer me a chair in the Department of Music, in addition to what I was doing with the Oregon Symphony, if I were to participate once a week in something, a lecture or something of that nature, which I loved to do, and I enjoyed it, and I was predisposed to accepting. But when I went out to have the conference with them, the president of the university said, I understand that you've become very interested in Holocaust studies as pertain to the music of Terezin and so forth. We have a couple of Holocaust scholars here on campus. I'd love to introduce you. So we all went to lunch. Very thoughtful of her to do this. And I told these guys the story that I had found, and that I needed to prove it one way or the other. And I was not able at this point to come across any more information than I found in this book of music at Terezin. And they said, well, first thing we got to do is let's go online and see what we can find. And so one thing led to the other. I'll skip over a few of these facts. One thing led to the other, and I was not able to find very much more than I already had found. I found out more about the performing arts in general at Terezin, yes, and something more about the lectures and the general environment that was becoming so rich. But I did not find out anything more about the Verde Requiem, other than the fact that it appears from this one source that there were 16 performances. And so these guys said, okay, what we have to do now is we have to go to primary sources. Let's go online and see what we can find. So they taught me how to post an announcement online. I'm a conductor. I'm looking for information pertaining to performances at the Terzin concentration camp of the Requiem Mass by Giuseppe Verdi, which happened between this date and this date, and one concert that was for the International Red Cross. And here are the names of the singers. Here's the name of the conductor. If there are family members of Rafael Schechter who know anything about the story, if there are people who were in the audience or sang in the choir, so forth and so on. I made up all the categories and put them into this email. And I said, please contact me. I would love to know more about the story. I'm anxious to know mainly how in the world he comes up with the idea of a requiem mass, I mean, a work steeped in the Catholic liturgy, in a place where everybody's in prison for being Jewish. What's this got all about? Plus the fact that there had to be an inordinate number of religious Jews. I mean, a lot of Jews were, you know, how shall I say, cultural Jews. They were not practicing in the way that many people do. That was not important to them. Being Jewish was important, but practicing was not that important. So there was that category, but there also were quite a number of rabbis in the camp. It makes sense, of course. So what was the attitude toward these religious Jews toward to a requiem mass that was being prepared and would be presented X number of times? All these questions that I needed to have answered. So I put a number of these things online, and these guys showed me how to send it off to a Holocaust website or two. And I pressed send and sat there knowing at any minute I was going to be flooded with responses that was going to clear this mess up once and for all. About 2 weeks later, not much had happened, but I did get one response from Israel. I didn't know it at the time, but the return address was IL, so that was Israel. And it was a very Israeli comment. Simply this: what do you want them for? That's all it said. You know, not we'd be happy to meet you, to talk with you, to delight you. May I introduce in, you know, why don't you come to my daughter's bar mitzvah next week? Nothing. It was just, what did you want them for? So I came clean and I said, I don't know. I honestly don't know. But if this did happen, then it seems to me it was more than a performance of Verdi's Requiem, that there probably was some underlying meaning or opportunity or reason or rationale or whatever. There had to be more to it than let's put on a show. And so I wrote back and I said, that's what I was interested in, and so forth. And so I waited, and it was another 10 days or so, and I got a message from the niece of Raphael Schechter, a woman who to this day lives in Jerusalem, and we know each other quite well now. And her name is Katya Manor, and her mother was the sister of Raphael Schechter, and her mother was in Terezin for a little while, and then because she was a nurse, she was moved over to Auschwitz, and she worked in the horrible thing to say, in the Mengele hospital. And so she writes back and said, family interested to know what this is all about. So I took these messages to my coaches, these two guys that taught me how to do this. And they read them and said, yes, what they're trying to find out is, are you trying to make some money off of them? And I said, oh, well, that's easy to answer. And I wrote back and I simply said, I'm interested to know, because if this event took place, the Verdi Requiem and so forth, there's got to be a story behind the story and all of that. And I would like to know more about it and perhaps help to expose it if that is in the interest of the family. Anyway, it wasn't long before I actually went over to Jerusalem to meet her and her mother, who lived in Haifa. And that was quite wonderful and interesting and got me started. And she's the one that says, you know, my uncle, according to my mother, my uncle had a friend in the camp by the name of Krasa, Krasa. And she said, now don't get excited. It's a pretty common Czech name. There are a lot of, so it's not going to be something outstanding. But we have no idea if he's still with us, if he's still alive, and even where he is. We know that he was in Prague after the war, and then we lose touch with him. He contacted a few people that we know, she said, when he got to Tel Aviv. And then we lost track of him after that. But my mother said that she had heard that he had relatives in the Boston area, and that he himself, Edgar Krasa, was a trained cook. His mother made him learn that, because if you're a cook, you'll always be where there's food. And so he went to some sort of culinary school and did very well. And that there were relatives in the Boston area who were in catering or something of that nature. She couldn't be more specific than that. So I thought, okay, well, when I got back, I called area 617, the Boston area, and I said to the operator, I'm looking for the name Krasa. And she said, the mother said that she thought that there was he was an Edward or something. Every name she mentioned began with E. So I thought, I'll ask for an E Krasa somewhere in the Boston area. The operator said, yes, we have in this suburb the name Edgar Krasa. She gave me the number, and this is how the conversation went. Ring, I hear, hello. And I thought, well, right accent, right age. And I said, Mr. Krasa, yes. Mr. Krasa, my name is Murry Sidlin. Please don't hang up. I only have one question to ask you. And this is, I'm not doing anything to track you down in any way. I only want to ask you one question. Does the name Raphael Schechter mean anything to you? And there was a silence. And then he said, well, I named one of my sons after him. So I began to, you know the word schwitz? You know that word? Okay, I began to schwitz. And I said to him, I said, Mr. Krasa, may I assume that you had been interned in Terezin? And he said, yes. He says, I was interned. Raphael Schechter was my roommate for about 2.5 years. And I thought, oh my God. So I was living in Portland at this time, and I said, Mr. Krasa, he said to me, he says, did I win something? Like this on the phone. And I said, hardly. And I said, but if I came to Boston this Friday, it was a terrible week. I didn't know how I was going to do this, but I knew I was going to do it. If I came to Boston this Friday, may I take you to lunch? And he says, aha. And he turns away. I could hear him say to his wife, Hannah, I just want a free lunch. So, which I was willing to do, of course. Anyway, I went to Boston to see him, and he met me at the hotel. I had arranged a table for lunch, and he says, no, no, no. He says, my car's right out front. Hannah is waiting for lunch in our home. And so he drives me 20 minutes from downtown Boston to his home, where I spent about 6 hours. Complete stranger, off the street, complete stranger, an email or two. And the next thing I know, I'm in his car, being taken to his home, introduced to his wife. And as we talked, the story came out. And he puts me on the phone to Marianka Zdadikov-May, who is also in the film, and Vera Schiff, who lives in Toronto. Marianka is still alive. She's 95 now, I guess. I spoke to her about a week ago, and she's doing okay. She's never really quite well, but she's doing okay. And Vera Schiff is doing very well. The Krasas, Mr. and Mrs. Krasa, have both left us. And so, but through Edgar Krause, the story began to come out because they were bunkmates. And even though Edgar Krause was younger by some years to Rafael Schechter and was not a musician, so he didn't travel in the same circles at the camp that Schechter did. Schechter was always around the other pianists and the composers and the singers and all of that. And Edgar Krause, however, used to sing in what we used to call a barbershop quartet. You know what that is? You know, just a group that sings harmonies together. You know that. And so Krause used to sing in a group like that. So he was recruited to sing in the choir, and he sang in all 16 performances. So that's really how it all started, and they got me started with, and then I started to talk in greater detail to the other singers, the other people who participated. There weren't many of them, but what I learned was quite astonishing, and what it meant and how it all came together. I'll wait for you to ask the specific questions you're interested in.
It's enthralling, Murry. You told me I can interrupt you at any time. I can't imagine ever wanting to interrupt you. If everybody feels the way I do, we could listen to you for hours. One of the survivors in the film says, I'm singing to God and hopefully God can hear us. But it's requiem, as you say, it's a Catholic mass, and it's a difficult piece of music. And as you mentioned, it's tough. What is it about this particular piece that attracted Schechter and everybody else that performed at Terezin?
We can't be sure. You know, the big problem with this project is that nobody was around taking notes of what they said. It wasn't like there was CNN every time you walked from one place to the other. There was very little documented information, but when they did have a conversation and the conversation was related to me, I get the feeling of the conversation. I try not to manufacture data, but I tell you this, that the Verde Requiem is an extraordinary work. It's a work of power, a work of drama, and it's a spiritual work. But look, you could be very, very Jewish, and if you're going to join a chorus somewhere, you're going to sing Christian music. You're going to do it. That's some of the greatest choral music that we have. And so I don't think that people minded that so much. I really don't. And I do think that there were things in the Requiem Mass that motivated Schechter. There's in the DS.
Tell us a little bit about the text of the music, the word deliverame, for example. Tell us a little bit about what resonated in those texts, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, liberame technically means deliver me, O Lord, but they saw it as liberate me, O Lord. And in the Dies Irae, the section of Day of Wrath, there is this one or two lines. Quid latet apparepit nil in nultum remanepit. Whatever is hidden shall become evident, and nothing shall remain unavenged. That's what it was. A lot of this was their ability to shake their fist at the Nazis and to sing what they could not say. And I think that was what it was. Did the Nazis come to see it? Were they affected by it? The commandant? No. That was not the point. The point was not to sing it at the Nazis and have them all get down on bended knee and ask the Jews for forgiveness. That was not going to happen. What was important was they sang it. What was important is that they sang it out loud. They could say things like this. Whatever is hidden shall become evident. Now, if you're Catholic, that's a kind of conversation between you and God. But if you're a Jew, if you're a prisoner in a concentration camp, whatever is hidden shall become evident simply means don't try to hide. God knows what you're doing. God knows, and you'll hear about it. Nothing shall remain unavenged. I personally think, after living in Schechter's head for a few years, more than a few years, I think that was the one section of the Mass that motivated him. other than the fact that it's absolutely drop dead gorgeous music, powerful music, beautiful music. It has such melodic, I mean, how shall I say, one gets such melodic satisfaction and rhythmic, and nobody can explode a chorus and orchestra better than Giuseppe Verdi, even though they didn't have an orchestra. But yet the people who were musicians who heard Gideon Klein play the accompaniment say that you could imagine an orchestra with his playing, because he was such a great pianist. And as a great pianist, he was very much in demand as well. So what was the next?
Murray, I think Mary has unfortunately fallen off the call, but I have a question. So in the film, you go back to Terezin and perform the Requiem almost in a concert performance, but before you do that, you go to the cellar where the chorus would have rehearsed. Can I ask, why did you do that? And could you tell us a little bit about that experience for yourself and for maybe other members of the chorus that you took?
Yeah, when Schechter rehearsed in that cellar, it was a larger area. Now it has a wall off here and there. They've changed it. But I wanted the chorus to get the feel for what it was like, just to go down into the basement. What we are about to do that afternoon, to sing the Verdi Requiem on the grounds at Terezín, this is something that they prepared to do, and there were 16 performances of it. It was just to connect. It was just to connect with the souls and the spirits of these extraordinary people who felt that they had to do this, that they wanted to do it. I mean, Schechter couldn't say, you will show up. Schechter could say, would you like to? May I invite you to? And by the way, you'll have to audition for me. I have to hear that you can carry a tune and all that sort of stuff. You know, so it wasn't a free ride. You had to have some capacity to sing. And they sang it quite well. I would like to tell you one story about a woman who was a fabulous pianist. We know that because she's made some recordings of the music of Victor Ullmann, who was one of the great composers at the camp. And her name was Edith Steiner Krauss. I met her before she died. She died at age 100. And I met her in Jerusalem. And I said to her, I said, Edith, you're a rather urbane musician. How did the chorus sound? Tell me, how was it? How were they? And she gave me one of these looks that, you know, I'm sure it was only about 3 seconds, but it felt like a weekend. It was one of these looks that said, I can't believe you're asking such a mundane question. She said, when you ask me a question like that, you're asking about all those musicianly things, aren't you? Like, did we sing in tune? What about the text? Were we rhythmically precise? Did we pronounce everything correctly? Was there a good choral balance? Was there a beautiful blend? All those musicianly things. And then she said, as if any of that mattered. She said, and here's the punchline. She said, we were so deeply inside the music that we returned to Verdi's desk. And that was her way of saying it was as though this music were written for us. And I've never forgotten it. Up until that moment, my greatest inspiration was Rafael Schechter and what he did. And in a moment, that response made me understand that the depth with which they needed this music and felt it and rehearsed it and performed it. It didn't matter. I mean, what gruel they ate was not going to give them any sense of nutrition. So they got their nutrition this way. They got it through music. And I know that that sounds like one of these, you know, statements that is, you know, kind of floats out there and has no basis in reality. And maybe that's so to those of us who didn't experience it, but when you talk to the people who sang it, they will tell you, yes, it was nutrition.
Incredible.
And so Yeah, yeah.
Incredible.
She was amazing. The other thing I want to tell you about her, as long as we're talking about some of the musicians were there, I said to her, I said, Edith, how did the chorus sound? And she said, you would have been proud of this chorus in any urban setting, meaning that any place you go where there's a big arts community, that this chorus could have competed quite well. And that was rather remarkable. I asked her, she said something. I said, how did you endure it? I mean, you were young, and usual kinds of questions that were so naive. I learned better than to ask naive questions after a while. And I asked her what it was like. And she says, the years in Terezin were some of the most wonderful years of my life. I know, your jaws all dropped to hit the table. Mine too. And she said to me, she says, yes, I see your response the same as it is for everyone. And here's how she answered that. She says, you have to understand, I was a young pianist just getting started. I had no management. I had nobody who was helping my career. So most of what I did was the business of music, sending out letters that I want to audition for this conductor or that concert manager or whatever. That I needed to get a foothold in. I needed to go out and play for people so that I could make recordings and do tours and all that sort of stuff. It was the business of music that consumed me. She says, now I find myself in Terezín, and the piano that was there, we shared it and so forth. She said, I played every day. I played every day. And in so doing, she said, I played for 10 people or 20 people or 4 people. And as I did it, I could see people getting better, feeling better. I could make a difference. She said that I remembered why I went into music. It was not the business of music, but I played every day. I could play Schubert, I could play Beethoven sonatas, I could play Brahms, I could play whatever I wanted. And people enjoyed and so forth. And I, again, naively, I said, the piano must have been out of tune. And she said, of course it was. That just comes with the territory. You know, sometimes there was a man there, Marianka told me this, there was a man there, she actually even told me his name, and that he was a dentist and he had a pliers with him. He brought a pliers with him. Why? I don't know. He brought a pliers with him. And Schechter taught him how to get the most out of tune strings back into some tune. So you could twang it and hear it come back in tune a little bit. It wouldn't stay forever, but it was better. So she says, yes, the piano was not in tune, and it was not in a place that was conducive to keeping it in tune, but I played every day, and I made a difference in people's lives, and I remembered why I was a musician.
Wonderful. Murry, I've got 2 more questions, and then I want to open up to the floor because we've got some wonderful questions in the chat. I just wanted to ask you, can you tell us a little bit about that day? When you performed the Requiem at Terezin, what was it like for you personally when you went back? If you could tell us a little bit about that day.
You know, when you're a conductor and you have people under your charge, in this case, it's an orchestra of about 76, 77. It was a chorus of about, I don't know, it was about 140, 150. And I had 4 soloists, and I had 2 actors. And these are the people under my charge. As much as I was taken, consumed with where I was and what I was doing and what we were about to do together, I could not allow myself to think beyond the responsibilities I had of being clear to the people who needed me, to be expressive to the people who wanted to be expressive and to whom I would give the license for expressivity. And so I really had to keep myself under control. I really did, because every time, you know, there are recitations in this presentation. We tell the story between movements, two actors and myself. And every time I turned around, I could look outside the door where people entered, and I could see the place where Edgar and Schechter lived. I could see I mean, you had to go in and upstairs, but I saw the building where they lived. And so this was not a theoretical exercise, but this was to honor all of these people and to recreate a moment of time in their history that belonged to them. It's a very complicated situation in Terezin. I remember when I went to one of the mass grave sites, that's just a little bit outside of the main part of the camp. And it's just sort of a large rectangular place in the ground covered with stones. I mean, there's a kind of a guardrail around it and covered with stones, you know, and the same kind of stones. If you went to a cemetery and you want to place stones on the gravestone to indicate someone has been there. And I remember I put my hand down on top of a large section of those stones. And I have to tell you, it didn't feel settled. It felt unsettled. I know that people think that I was just living too much into this, and that was perhaps my own fantasy. Maybe it was. I can only tell you what I felt. That this was a place that is ugly and horrible, and where thousands of souls were caused to die and mistreated in death. And I was glad we had come back to let them know they were heard. You know,
I want to.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, carry on, Murry.
No, I just wanted to say that when I was living in Portland, Oregon, when I went there for the job at the Oregon Symphony, I met a wonderful rabbi, became good friends with Emmanuel Rose. And I remarked to him one night at dinner, I said, Manny, I just got back from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and I couldn't believe when I went into the shop on the way out, the explosion of new recordings, new books, new films. I mean, there's just tremendously more information than there was even 5-10 years ago. And he said, yeah, this is all coming from the grandchildren, you know. I mean, the survivors try to, how should we say, shield their own children from the horror of what they experienced. But the grandchildren, they wound up talking to the grandchildren. The grandchildren go to high school and they start studying World War II, and they put together the accent and the age of the grandparents, and they come to the grandparents, put their finger underneath the chin of the grandparents and say, I want to know, and I want to know now. That very special relationship where grandparents will, and they did talk to them. And so Manny says, all of this is coming from the grandchildren now, all the new experience. But the other reason is this. He says, you know, in the event of world events that historically they're apocalyptic events. In the event when these events take place, the facts come out right away. We know what happened, but it's the truth that takes a long time. And it appears as though that we're finally ready for the truth. So that's Manny's.
Rabbi Rose.
Rabbi Rose taught me that.
What do you hope, Murry, that we, the audience, will take away from this extraordinary film?
Well, first of all, you know, what happened at Terezín, I'm afraid, maybe unfinished given the amount of anti-Semitism that we are all aware of worldwide. And I don't think this is a time to, you know, rest on our laurels. We've handled this well, and now let's go on and try to get rid of this disease and go back to life. There are things that we need to remain aware of, that people will do this. I mean, this was not done by machinery. This is human beings did this to other human beings. And for many of them, their response was the most extraordinary gifts of life that we have. The arts, humanities, that, you know, and that we learn that we are capable of expressing the extraordinary gifts of life through music, through dance, through painting, through literature. We have these gifts, and there are people who are willing to share these gifts. We have to listen to them. We have to listen to them. They know the truth. They know the truth. The truth is not these rotten politicians that bombard the airwaves. That's not the truth. That's just, you know, don't get me started on that. Let's just say that what we do know more than anything else is that I know that when I conduct the Verde Requiem, I'm going to change lives. I know that. I know that. And when I do Mahler or Beethoven or Schumann or Schubert or contemporary music where people have a new voice that hasn't been heard, it's my responsibility to help bring this out so that we learn, so that we are moved and we are changed. We have to change. We always have to change. And we have to.
That's a wonderful moment for us to segue into some of the audience's questions. That was beautiful. Thank you, Murry. And Claudia, if I can hand over to you, we'll have a few questions just so that the audience aren't left without any answers, if that's okay with you, Murry.
Absolutely.
And I'll leave. Thank you. That was extraordinary.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a question from our colleague in Cape Town, Linda Hackner. She's asking, to what extent did the choral verse and the orchestra know about the history of the Holocaust when they agreed to go back to Terezin with you? And I'd like to also ask within this question, my colleague Maureen's question. She wants to know, was there much persuasion involved in getting your choir and your orchestra to go with you to Terezin? Did you have to explain the story to them? What did they know about the story when they performed it?
Well, I certainly, when I asked people to come along, I told them why. I said, this is not just an ordinary event. I mean, it would be reason enough to sing the Verde Requiem, but we're singing it there, and here's why. Yes, so I mean, everybody that came had a very clear idea. And before that chorus went down into the basement to sing that rehearsal, I had them go through the historic museum at Terezín, which was really an excellent museum to give them the history of what took place there and a little bit better idea of where they were and what we were doing. So yes, I will tell you this, before we went, I got a phone call from a person who represented 5 others. She was a singer in the chorus of the New York City Opera. And she says, Mr. Sidlin, what's all this about you going to Terezín and doing the Verde Requiem on the grounds of the Terezin concentration camp? Started out with, what's all this? And I said, well, yes, we've been invited to come, and I put together a chorus from Catholic University, plus some other components of the chorus. And she says, well, my friends and I are coming. I said, I beg your pardon. She says, yeah, we're paying our own way. Every year we vacation together. We always go someplace where we want to do something together. There are 5 of us all together. And we all know the Verde Requiem inside and out. We've sung it many times, and we want to be a part of that. So we're paying our own way, and don't try to stop us. We're coming. So we, and they, the 5 of them, have sung in about 7 or 8 performances with us now, where we have been invited to perform. So there's some people that, you know, I couldn't beat them off with a club if I wanted to. But everyone that was coming there knew intimately what had taken place and why we were recreating. So no one was doing this in a vacuum. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Fiona's asking, did Edgar and Hannah meet in Terezin? And do you think that Rafael Schechter had the choice of any other material besides Verdi's Requiem?
The second part first. Yeah, sure. He could have selected, but you know, he only brought 2 scores with him. That we know. He brought the opera, the Bartered Bride. Someone is in the audience here who did a thesis on opera at Terezín. And if if she would be kind enough to identify herself, she would be happy to confirm that they did quite a number of performances of the Bartered Bride, an opera by the great Czech composer Smetana, which still remains as the Czech opera. I think it does. I don't think in the United States, I don't think we have an opera that's the American opera. We have several good operas, but not one that we think of in the way that the Czechs think. But how did I happen to mention that? Why did I mention that? What was part of your question that wanted to know that?
We were talking about what choices he would have had in terms of music.
Yes. Well, and so there are other opera requiems he could have done, the Mozart and several others, but this is the one that. And anyway, he brought with him 2 scores, the Bartered Bride and the Verde Requiem. Why did he bring the Verde Requiem? Did he bring it because he had hoped to, wherever they're going to go, he's going to put together a performance? No, he had no idea where they're going. He had no idea where Terezin was. And when he got there, there was not an arts community in action yet. That took quite some time. So he took the Verde Requiem with him, I think, this is my own assumption, because he couldn't leave home without it, because it was a work that meant a great deal to him. It's a work of beauty, of drama, of power. It gives courage. And it doesn't matter that it's a Catholic work to musicians. I mean, it's a work about God and spirituality. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Christ is mentioned about 5 or 6 times in the entire score. So it's not the point. The point was, it's a religious work. It's an inspirational work. It is a fantastic work of drama and power. And that's what motivated him to do that. But he didn't bring it with him hoping to put together a performance. He brought it with him because if he had a time to open to any page, it was inspiring, because he loved the work. It meant a great deal to him. And it was also not only a work to love, but to admire. When you see the amount of counterpoint in this piece, you think to myself, oh my God, was Verdi as great a contrapuntalist as Bach was? Well, if you look at the double fugue of the Sanctus, you would say, yes, indeed. He certainly was, at least in that small portion of the Requiem.
Thank you. And just the other part of that question, did Edgar and Hannah meet in Terezin?
Yes, no, they did not. They met after the war at a Jewish center in Prague. And then it wasn't long after that that they decided to get married, and then went off to their first adventure, which I think was Tel Aviv. And then from then on. One of their sons was born in Israel, and the other one, Rafi, was born in Boston.
Thank you. Our friend Carl Wilkins has asked, well, he said, so inspired by the journey this film took me on. I could listen to Murray forever. Thank you. My question is, when you speak to young children, and he mentions, I know we spoke about this before we started, your son's picture on the wall. What story do you share maybe with 5th or 6th graders about Terezin? How do you tell this story to younger audiences?
We have a version of this film which is 45 minutes, which can be used in classes. It depends on how young. I mean, there's an age that I think maybe it's best to wait for a while. But if we're talking about what we normally call 5th or 6th graders, I think that it's possible that we can tell them the story. We can tell them of what one group of human beings did to another group. Maybe we have to not get so detailed about it, but to tell them that because some people had a separate, a religion that was different, you know what I'm talking about, that they were gathered in and sent to their form of prison and jail and so forth like this, and they lived like this. I'm not sure when is the best time to do it, but I'll tell you this, we have, and it's available to all teachers, anyone, it's online, it's on our Defiant Requiem website, .org. We have a terrific group of lesson plans that are available for teachers to use or for people just to peruse if they wish. And that helps us get the idea across of what happened, how it happened, what was the result of it, and all of that. So it's such a difficult subject to, I think, to paint in such a way that is in focus that we decided to put these lesson plans up and to use the 45-minute version of the film with the lesson plans. And we think that that helps terrifically. This is free and online if you know people who want to dabble in it. You're welcome to them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our friend Pamela Tanzik, who is the person with the masters, she said, she's asking, was Edgar Krauser related to the composer Hans Krauser?
Pamela, is it? Pamela, I asked him that 14,000 times, and only because I was hoping to just sort of, move his mind a little bit, but I never got to the point where he said, "Oh yeah, he's my 5th cousin." I never got there. All he would say is that Krauser is a fairly common Czech.
Yes, it's like Smith.
That's right. It's like Smith or Jones. That's right.
Yeah, but just to answer your question, the Bartlett Bride was performed, and I interviewed many years ago Karel Beerman, who was and an extraordinary person, and he also sang the part of the Death in Victor Ullmann's opera The Kaiser von Atlantis.
That's
and
right.
He told me there were actually partly 2 orchestras, entire orchestras in Terezin from the 2 theaters from Prague, but they had no instruments.
That's right.
So it would have not been the problem of not having an orchestra, but they just didn't have instruments. But you had very musical people.
Yes, indeed. And some of them, Egon Ledich was there, wonderful concertmaster, and Robert Thalberg, great cellist, Victor Kohn, another. These are people who played in the Czech Philharmonic and they taught at the major conservatories. Now, there was in Prague, you may know this, near all those synagogues in the Jewish quarter, there was a kind of a warehouse where the Nazis were collecting instruments from Jewish musicians all over Europe, and they were going to post them there. This was all part, that was supposed to become what they called the Museum of the Extinct Race.
Yeah.
And there in this warehouse, they were going to have all these instruments. So when they made a part of that documentary film of the Pavel Haas, the Etude for Strings, they managed to get instruments sent up by truck to Terezin. They used them. the conductor, Karel Anschel, rehearsed them. They did it. They put it on film, put the instruments back in the truck, and they went back to Prague. So for specific occasions, they would allow instruments to be used. But this is another thing that's interesting. One of the musicians, Robert Dahlberg, who was 23 years old when he was murdered, a wonderful cellist, and he wrote one composition called, Serenade for violin solo. He was a cellist, but he wrote a piece for violin and piano. And he brought his cello to camp, but he had it taken apart in Prague by a person who's called the luthier. That's a person who repairs and builds and rebuilds string instruments. So he did not bring his great cello, he brought his fair cello, and he had it taken apart, and then the parts put into the suitcase or whatever it was, the duffel bag, and he brought it up and then reassembled it in Terezin. So there were some exceptions like that, but mostly the instruments didn't exist.
Mm. And just on another note, what was interesting, what Karel Berman told me, there was, of course, huge censorship. So the Nazis did look exactly in terms of text. But what they sometimes did, because like the Barted Bride, sang in Czech, and also in the Emperor of Atlantis, there was even the German national anthem in it as a composition piece.
They did it backwards. They did
exactly.
Deutschland über alles. They actually played some of it backwards.
So they had sort of musical codes.
Yes. And by the way, Pamela, I'm sure you know this. If you go on YouTube and you look up Karel, K-A-R-E-L, Berman.
Yes.
One N, not two, Berman.
One N, yeah.
You can find a fantastic aria from a Smetana opera called The Kiss.
Yes, Kubichka.
Yeah, and Berman sings it. Oh my God! With, I think with the Czech Philharmonic and Karel Anschel, the great Czech.
They're conducting. Yeah,
he's conducting.
Oh, I will have a look. Thank you.
Thank you, Murry. We will definitely have a look. If you don't mind, I'm just going to ask some of the audience questions. Thanks, Pamela. It was lovely to listen in. We've had a question just privately. This film focuses rather on the survivors and on the victims' stories rather than maybe perpetrator actions. And I just wanted to ask you, why do you think that's important, and what did it mean to the survivors to be a part of making this film?
We consciously stayed away from any of the unspeakable. We wanted people to watch this film and to learn the story. We all have seen the horrors. We know about them. We consciously stayed away from that. We mentioned it. We talk about the number of dead. We talk about the starvation and so forth, but we did not feel it was our role to reiterate the horror of that. We needed to tell the story, and we wanted people to watch this film. And so that was very much on our minds. As far as the survivors participating in the film, we asked every one of them, and when we finished making the film, before we actually declared the film completely made, we showed it to everybody who's in the film to make sure they were okay with it, that they didn't say anything embarrassing to them or something that they don't believe any longer or something of that nature. We needed to have a clean bill of health from the people who participated. Again, that's something that was very, very important to us. These were our teachers, these were our colleagues, and we were our objective was to serve them and not to do anything that they didn't agree with, which also is true for the live performance. When we do Defiant Requiem live and we do the Verde Requiem, when we have two actors and we have videos between movements and we tell the story that way too, They saw the script before we did this. And so they had to approve everything that we did.
How many times have you, that have you performed the Defiant Requiem, as you say, with the Terezin story?
50.
Wow, that's 50. Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Well, we you know, you can blame COVID. We had 3 or 4 cancellations, but we hope, and one especially, we hope will reinvent itself. It's, you know, this was to be the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Holland, and we were invited to Amsterdam to perform it on that weekend. So of course it was postponed, but we hope it will be resuscitated for next year. But we had about 4 performances, 3 or 4 performances that we were supposed to do the end of this past year and through December, but everything is on hold. But right now we're at number 50.
Wow, that's incredible. Murry, it's been an absolutely extraordinary evening, and I mean, the charm with which you share this unbelievable story. I think for me, what I recall when you say we have to tell the people of the unmarked graves that we have heard them.
Yes. Yes.
And we have heard you tonight. It's been absolutely beautiful. Thank you for the privilege. Thank you to everybody who's joined us, and we'd like you to have the last word, Murry.
Well, I just want to thank you. It means so much to us, to my organization and myself, when we're invited to share the story and share the film. As you know, it's just really important that we keep the story alive, that they're not, I mean, let's just say that Terezín is not one of the most, a place that has the same level of fame. I hate to use that word in this case, that, you know, many others, but we need to bring to everybody's attention that these people fought back, and the Jews were not inactive. They fought back, but they fought back with beauty, with dignity, with philosophy, with literature, with music, with painting, with the arts, and kept themselves enriched. As one survivor said to me, you know, that we had to be harmonious. And I said to him, well, yes, the Verde is a lot of great, it's a great piece of music, wonderful Verde harmonies. He says, not that kind of harmony. No, he says, I saw people go out on stage, and I saw a conductor who raises his hands and gives elegant gestures, and they responded in kind. And what came out was harmonious. He says, we lived in insanity and chaos. And when we saw harmony at work, we had faith and hope that it still exists and we'll get through it.
Thank you for those inspiring and beautiful words. Thank you to everybody for joining us. On a lighter note, Murry was terribly concerned that the beautiful piece of art behind him would be a distraction. But we've had a question in the chat from Travis Rabinowitz asking, can you tell us a little bit about that painting?
Well, yes, it goes right through my head, as you see, and frankly, it's quite painful, and I've got to do something about it. I'll move out of the way. This is one of my wife's paintings.
Wow.
She's an artist, and as you can see, she's an abstract expressionist, and this is a painting we both like very much. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing it with us, and thank you, Murry, from the bottom of our hearts for a truly inspiring evening. It's been a privilege, and thank you to the Defiant Requiem Foundation for making it possible. Thank you to all of you for joining us. We look forward to you joining us at our next webinar. In the meantime, all of you, please stay safe and stay well and keep in touch. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone.